Whispers in the dark, the trial of Camazotz. The entrance yawned before them, a jagged maw of stone swallowing the dim, flickering torchlight. Beyond there was nothing, no sound, no air, only a darkness so complete it seemed to press against their skin. Hunahpu and Xbalanque stood at the threshold, their breaths shallow, their hands tightening on the hafts of their blowguns. The lords of Xibalba had sent them here with mocking smiles, their voices dripping with the promise of death. "The bat house welcomes you," they had said, their skeletal fingers gesturing lazily toward the cavern. No one who entered had ever returned. "Quiet, isn't it?" Hunahpu muttered, his voice a thin thread of sound that seemed to snap under the weight of the silence. "Too quiet," Xbalanque replied, his eyes fixed on the blackness. "They're waiting for us." A low, fetid breeze drifted out of the opening, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and damp earth. It brushed past their faces like the exhale of something vast and unseen, stirring the tiny hairs on the back of their necks. "Let's not keep them waiting then," Hunahpu said, forcing a grin. It didn't reach his eyes. As they stepped forward, the stone door behind them groaned and slammed shut with a reverberating boom. The sound echoed into the darkness and died, leaving nothing in its wake. No light seeped in through the cracks. The twins were plunged into an absolute suffocating blackness. Hunahpu raised his hand, feeling the air shift around him. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Xbalanque paused, straining to listen. The silence was oppressive, but underneath it, there was something faint, a whisper of movement, like wings brushing against stone. "Above," Xbalanque murmured. They both froze, their bodies tense, their breath barely audible. A sound came again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate scrape of claws against rock, high above their heads. It was deliberate, purposeful, and impossibly close. Hunahpu reached for the torch, but Xbalanque stopped him. "Not yet," he hissed. "Fire will show them where we are." "Not lighting it might do the same," Hunahpu countered under his breath. But he lowered his hand, his grip tightening around his weapon. The silence returned, but now it was alive. It stretched and coiled around them, oppressive and unrelenting. And somewhere in the vast, unseen dark, something shifted. Watching, waiting. "Stay close," Xbalanque whispered. They moved forward, the stone beneath their feet slick with moisture. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from unseen corners, each drop loud in the suffocating quiet. The air grew heavier, laden with a dampness that clung to their skin. And then, just as they began to make out the faintest outlines of the cavern's walls, the sound returned. This time it was everywhere. Wings, claws, a low, guttural screech that seemed to rise from the shadows themselves. They weren't alone. The sound faded, swallowed by the endless dark. Hunahpu tightened his grip on his blowgun, the smooth wood slick with sweat. His throat was dry, but he dared not swallow. Every sound seemed too loud in this place. Even their breathing felt like a beacon. "Left or right?" Hunahpu's voice was barely a whisper. Xbalanque didn't answer immediately. He was staring into the dark, as if his eyes could carve through the blackness. He couldn't. No one could. "It doesn't matter," Xbalanque finally murmured. "This place was built to swallow us." They moved forward slowly. Each step was deliberate, the slap of bare feet on damp stone muffled but still far too loud. The air grew colder, clinging to their skin like a damp shroud. The silence wasn't empty. There was a presence in it. It coiled around them, settling over their shoulders like a predator's gaze. Somewhere above, something scraped against stone. Hunahpu froze, his head tilted upward, though he could see nothing. "It's following us," he mouthed. Xbalanque gave the faintest nod. He already knew. They pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth of the bat house. The walls seemed to breathe around them, stone slick with moisture, pulsing with faint echoes. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, a rhythm that quickened and slowed as if responding to their presence. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The sound of water, the scraping above. The silence was so total it pressed against their ears. Xbalanque slowly raised his hand, signaling Hunahpu to stop. And then they heard it. Breathing, not their own. Slow, wet, close. the kind of breath that came from something ancient, something that hadn't needed to breathe in a very long time, but did so now, just to remind them it was there. Xbalanque's eyes flicked upward. The ceiling was not as far away as it had seemed. Shapes clung to it, shapes that weren't stone. Long hooked claws, furred wings folded tight, dozens of them. No, hundreds. They weren't alone in the bat house. They never had been. One of the shapes shifted, slowly. A leathery wing unfurled, stretching into the dark. A glimmer of pale teeth caught what little light there was. Camazotz. It hadn't moved before because it hadn't needed to. But now it was awake. Xbalanque's breath caught in his throat. "Don't move," he whispered, barely audible. But Hunahpu had already taken a step back. The sound of his foot scraping against loose stone was deafening. Silence fractured. A low, rattling hiss filled the air, and the darkness moved. The wings of the beasts above unfurled with a sound like tearing cloth, and the air filled with the deafening beat of wings. Xbalanque barely had time to shout before the first shape dropped from the ceiling. It wasn't a bat. It was something far older, far hungrier. Claws glistened in the dark, slicing the air where Hunahpu had stood a moment before. They ran, blindly, recklessly, their feet slapping against wet stone. The air behind them boiled with movement, wings slashing the darkness to ribbons. Hunahpu's chest burned, his legs pumping harder than they ever had in the ball court. But the bat house had no walls to rebound against, no lines to cross. Only darkness, only death. "Down!" Xbalanque's voice cracked through the chaos. Hunahpu dove to the ground just as something massive streaked overhead, the wind of its passing nearly lifting him off the ground. Camazotz. The god of death and night didn't need to strike yet. It was hunting, playing, waiting for them to make a mistake. In the choking dark, Hunahpu's hand closed around something smooth and round. A shape. It was cool in his palm. A squash. Xbalanque's voice found him in the dark. "Brother?" But Hunahpu didn't answer, because now the breathing was all around them, and Camazotz was waiting. The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of wet stone and something older. Decay. The shadows moved, though nothing stirred. Hunahpu's fingers tightened around the smooth squash in his palm, its surface slick with condensation. It felt absurdly fragile in this place of sharpened wings and silent death. Xbalanque crept forward, every step measured, every breath drawn shallow. His eyes darted upward, where the ceiling should have been, but it was lost to the dark. The things above were awake now, their wings rustling against the damp air. And somewhere among them, larger than the rest, Camazotz watched. A slow, deliberate scrape echoed from above, the drag of talons across stone. Then silence, the kind of silence that stretched taut, vibrating just before it shatters. Xbalanque froze, too quiet. A gust of foul air slammed into them, and the world erupted. Camazotz fell from the ceiling like a thunderbolt, wings spread wide, blotting out the last traces of light. His form was monstrous, a warped blend of bat and man, fur matted with blood, fangs yellowed and sharpened by centuries. The screech that tore from his throat was not sound but violence, a shock wave that rattled their bones. Xbalanque dove aside instinctively, rolling across a slick stone. The air where he'd stood was slashed open by claws the size of knives. "Hunahpu!" he shouted, but the words barely rose over the shriek. Hunahpu turned too late. Something massive and cold slammed into him, knocking him backward. His body struck the stone hard, the squash skittering from his grip. He gasped, windless, scrambling to his feet. A shadow loomed over him, wings folding inward like a shroud. The gleam of teeth flashed once, then darkness. The sound was soft, a wet, meaty snap. Silence followed. Xbalanque's breath caught in his throat. Where Hunahpu had been, there was nothing. The air seemed heavier now, the shadows, deeper. And then slowly Camazotz rose from the black, clutching something in his talons. It dangled limply. Hunahpu's head, eyes still open, wide with shock. Blood dripped in slow, deliberate beats onto the stone. Drip. Drip. Camazotz let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the stone as he turned and melted back into the dark, the head still in his grasp. Xbalanque didn't move. Couldn't. His mind was screaming, but his body remained frozen, every instinct warring between fight and flight. The wings above rustled again, shifting. Camazotz wasn't done. Not yet. A flicker of movement caught Xbalanque's eye. The squash. It rested a few feet away, its smooth surface glinting faintly in the dark. An idea, desperate and wild, flared in his mind. Slowly, silently, he crept toward it, each step deliberate. Above, Camazotz circled, savoring his hunt. Xbalanque's hand closed around the squash. It was cold, heavy. His fingers worked quickly, carving crude features with the edge of his blowgun. Eyes, nose, mouth. Not perfect, but enough. Enough to fool the gods. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. He knelt beside his brother's body, gently pressing the carved squash onto the broken neck. It held, barely. A rasping growl echoed through the cavern. Camazotz had noticed. Too late. Xbalanque rose slowly, bracing himself. "Come then," he whispered into the dark. The air shifted, but Camazotz didn't strike. Not yet, because in that moment, Xbalanque wasn't prey. He was bait, and now the hunter would fall into his own trap. The shadows seemed to breathe. Xbalanque pressed himself against the cold stone, his body still, every muscle tight as a bowstring. He couldn't hear his own heartbeat over the suffocating silence. Somewhere in the black, Camazotz watched, circling in the air, invisible but impossibly near. "Where's Hunahpu?" Xbalanque's eyes darted through the dark, searching for any sign of his brother. Only the faint rustle of wings answered him, slow and steady like something circling, waiting. Waiting for what? A flicker of movement. Xbalanque caught the barest outline of Hunahpu crouched in the distance, hand pressed to the wall, motionless. His brother's head tilted slightly, listening. Above him, something shifted. Camazotz. The beast descended in silence, wings tucked tight against its body. The massive shape blended perfectly with the darkness until it was nearly upon him. Xbalanque opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. A blur of motion, the glint of fangs, and then a sharp, wet crack. The sound cut through the dark like a knife. Xbalanque flinched, his breath catching in his throat. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then a soft thud. Something rolled across the stone. Xbalanque stared, frozen, as a round shape wobbled to a stop in the shallow glow of dying torchlight. It was Hunahpu's head. His brother's wide, unblinking eyes stared into the void, mouth slightly open as if caught mid-breath. Blood trailed in thin streams, pooling slowly on the cold stone. The wings above them stirred again, restless. Camazotz let out a low, rasping breath, almost a purr, as he retreated into the dark, cradling the lifeless body. Xbalanque couldn't move, couldn't think. His mind screamed at him to do something, but his body refused. He's gone. His brother, his other half, was gone. But then, something strange. The head. It didn't slump in lifelessness. The eyes still stared, alert, as if watching, waiting. Xbalanque's breath quickened. No, Hunahpu wasn't gone. Not yet, not completely. His hand brushed against the ground, fingers closing around the smooth, round surface of the squash he had carved earlier. The weight of it settled into his palm, not heavy enough to be a head, not quite. But in this suffocating dark, could it be enough to fool a god? A slow, terrible idea took shape in his mind. He crept forward, every movement deliberate, his breath thin and silent. Camazotz had withdrawn, momentarily satisfied. Xbalanque reached Hunahpu's body, trembling. His hands worked quickly, lifting the carved squash to the raw, severed neck. It didn't fit perfectly, but it fit. The carved face stared back at him with crude, hollow eyes. It would have to do. A slow shift in the air. Camazotz was circling back. Xbalanque pressed himself low, holding his breath. The creature's wings stirred the stagnant air as it hovered. It watched, waited, but Hunahpu's body didn't fall, didn't betray him. Camazotz hissed low in confusion, and in that moment of hesitation, Xbalanque knew. The deception worked, but it wouldn't last. Not for long. The god of death was too clever, too old to be fooled for more than a heartbeat. Xbalanque's grip tightened on his blowgun. He would only get one chance, and death was already watching. The darkness held its breath. Camazotz circled above, wings slicing through the stale air with slow, deliberate strokes. His glowing eyes narrowed, fixed on the figure below, the body of Hunahpu, now wearing a crude, grinning squash for a head. The god of death was waiting for movement, a mistake. Xbalanque crouched in the shadows, barely daring to breathe. His pulse hammered in his throat, but his mind was cold and sharp. The deception had worked for now, but Camazotz was ancient. He would not be fooled for long. I have to end this. But how do you kill a god? Xbalanque's eyes scanned the floor, searching for anything to use. The cavern was bare stone, slick with moisture and shadow. His fingers brushed against the jagged edge of a broken rock, sharp as obsidian. Not much, but it would have to do. Above, Camazotz shifted. His wings folded inward as he descended slowly, claws flexing. The god wasn't satisfied. He wanted proof of death. Xbalanque's heart pounded harder. Then it came, a low guttural growl. Camazotz lunged. Xbalanque moved. Silent as a serpent, he darted forward and snatched Hunahpu's severed head from where it had rolled. It was cold in his hands, slick with blood. Camazotz's massive form slammed into the ground where Hunahpu's body had lain. The squash shattered beneath his claws, splitting open with a wet crack. Seeds spilled across the stone. The god froze. The growl deepened into a snarl. Xbalanque didn't hesitate. He hurled Hunahpu's head with all his strength into the black void behind Camazotz. The head spun through the air, vanishing into the dark. Camazotz shrieked, a terrible grating sound that shook the very walls. He turned sharply, wings snapping open, and tore after the sound of the rolling head, his form melting into the shadows. Now Xbalanque lunged for Hunahpu's body, gripping it under the arms. It was heavier than he expected, limp and cold. He dragged his brother into the nearest crevice, heart pounding so loudly he thought it might give them away. He pressed Hunahpu's body against the wall, clutching him tightly, breathing hard. Above, the cavern erupted in fury. Camazotz tore through the shadows, slamming into walls, wings battering the air. His screeches filled the bat house, echoing off the stone in waves of sound. But he couldn't find the head. Xbalanque shut his eyes, holding his breath as dust and stone rained down around them. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then slowly, the shrieks grew distant. Camazotz was searching elsewhere. Xbalanque exhaled, trembling. But they weren't safe yet. I need to bring you back, brother. His hands worked fast, fumbling in the dark. He tore strips from his tunic, wrapping them around Hunahpu's severed neck. It wasn't enough, but it would hold. He leaned in close. You are not gone, Xbalanque whispered, his voice shaking. Not yet. In the myths of the underworld, life and death were a thin veil. There was still a chance. Xbalanque reached for the darkness inside himself, calling on ancient words, fragments of spells their father had whispered once, half-remembered prayers. Blood to blood, bone to bone, he murmured, pressing the remains of the squash against Hunahpu's neck. Breath to breath. Nothing. The air remained still. Then, a flicker, a shiver ran through Hunahpu's body, almost imperceptible. Xbalanque froze. A faint, shallow breath escaped his brother's lips. Brother? Nothing more. But it was enough. Camazotz shrieked in fury as the stone walls of the bat house began to tremble. The god had realized the trick. Xbalanque's eyes shot upward. The air was moving again, fast. He grabbed Hunahpu under the arms and hauled him to his feet. On your feet, brother. We're not dead yet. The stone walls groaned. Somewhere in the dark, the doors of the bat house were beginning to open, the ancient stone grinding against itself. Camazotz's screech filled the space behind them. Closer now, a wall of sound. Xbalanque didn't look back. He half-carried, half-dragged Hunahpu toward the thin sliver of light that was growing ahead of them. The wind of Camazotz's wings tore past them, close enough to rip the air from their lungs. But they didn't stop. Not until they crossed the threshold. Not until the stone doors slammed shut behind them, with a final, deafening boom, and the darkness was gone. The stone doors groaned as they sealed shut, drowning the bat house in eternal darkness. Xbalanque collapsed just beyond the threshold, his chest heaving, the cold air burning in his lungs. Hunahpu's limp body sagged against him, unnervingly still, but he was breathing, barely. The stone beneath them was cool, but it didn't seem to cling to them like the suffocating damp of the bat house. The oppressive weight of unseen eyes was gone, but the silence that followed was not comforting. A slow, deliberate sound broke the quiet. Clap. A single, hollow clap that echoed unnaturally through the cavern. Xbalanque's head snapped up. The lords of Xibalba stood in the shadows beyond, draped in bone and silk, their faces half concealed by masks carved with grinning skulls. Their empty eyes watched, gleaming with something between amusement and hunger. One death stepped forward, his thin lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You survived," he said, voice soft as silk and just as cold. "How?" "Unexpected." Beside him, Seven Death tilted his head thoughtfully. "But not unscarred," he murmured, his gaze sliding to Hunahpu's slack form, the makeshift bindings at his neck. "Your brother looks incomplete." Xbalanque said nothing. His grip on Hunahpu tightened. The lords of Xibalba didn't move closer. They didn't need to. Their presence filled the cavern, pressing down like a weight on Xbalanque's chest. "You tricked Camazotz," One Death continued, his tone almost admiring. "No one has ever deceived him before." Seven Death's smile was thinner. "But tricks can't save you forever." Their laughter, dry and brittle, echoed into the dark as they slowly receded into the shadows, their forms dissolving like smoke. And then, silence. Xbalanque let out a slow, ragged breath, but his hands were still shaking. He turned to Hunahpu, studying his pale face. The crude bindings at his neck were beginning to stain through with blood. "This won't hold forever." Xbalanque swallowed hard, forcing his limbs to move. They weren't safe. Not yet. The lords would send them to the next trial soon, and the next might not offer a chance for tricks. Xbalanque tightened his grip on Hunahpu and stared into the dark path ahead. "We keep moving," he whispered, "no matter what." And so, step by step, they vanished into the shadows. The gods were not finished with them, and neither was death.